Greetings, this is Eugene the Philostopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now, in this video, I wish to talk to you about what I would call adopted stories, but let's start with another thing. Now, obviously, I haven't made any videos for more than 3 months already, and if you've watched my last video, you're probably guessing why is that the case, and if you know that I live in Belarus, and if you follow the news, etc., etc., so really the situation in my country isn't really anything helpful in terms of any sort of creative activity. Although maybe in one of the following videos I'll show you one of the pieces of creative activity which was kind of cool, in this respect at least. But anyway, you could also notice that the video is a bit different. It's because my previous phone on which I filmed everything before that died, so I bought a new one and it's different, and so yeah, so I'll try to kind of mitigate the damage in this sense somehow, but we'll see. So yeah, I'll definitely make a follow-up video for the White Wings of Liberty sometime later, but following my own schedule. I have my own esoteric kind of schedule of topics that I wish to cover, so this topic was more appropriate for this particular time. And also, if we're talking about White Wings of Liberty, the situation is still more or less in the same spot it was in the previous video. Although, I mean, loads of things have happened, but fundamentally nothing has changed. I mean, people understood already back then that it's gonna happen this way, right? Even though there were quite a bit of surprises along the way, and we'll talk about that some other time, if I'm gonna be alive still. Okay, so, but now I wish to talk to you about this phenomenon that I wish to call adopted stories, which is, well, let's begin from some more vague things. So, in my previous videos, multiple times I've stated that culture itself, and let's say knowledge in particular and history, may be described as the certain network of patterns, you might say, or network of stories. In particular, like in my video Nature of Knowledge, I talk about the realization, let's say, that knowledge can be represented as the network of stories connected to each other, reinforcing or denying each other of sorts of power, etc., etc. It's sort of a power network in some sense, right? Fight for resources among the stories, among those patterns of thinking, patterns of interpretation, blah, blah, blah. So, but in this particular video, I'm going to focus on a certain process that takes place in this super large network of culture, and in particular a process when a certain entity, whether it's a person or some institution or a whole subculture or whatever, copies parts of this cultural network into the other domain, let's say their own domain, right? So, or rather not even parts of the network, but maybe even perceptions thereof, but we'll talk about that a little bit later near the end of this video. All right, so we're copying parts of this network, like certain patterns, and again, I apologize for speaking in those super abstract terms, but I'll give you some examples. So here I'm trying to talk about in the most fundamental sense, right? So it may be, it may look too vague, but I'll give you some examples, so hopefully you would be able to follow my thought. So we're copying parts of this cultural network to other parts of the same network, because it's all connected anyway, right? So we copy stories, you might say transplant them, you know, almost like a plant. Like if you imagine that a network is like a network of roots, or like, you know, a tree with branches, etc., and leaves. So, you know, you can transplant like a piece of a tree, or like just plant it into the ground and it would grow. So it's more or less what we're dealing with here, right? We're taking stuff from one spot and putting it in another spot, and it starts growing there, or at least it retains some characteristic patterns of itself while it was in the previous spot. And those kinds of stories, those kinds of networks that were transplanted in such way, I would call adopted stories. Right, so this is the basic overall intuitive, vague intro, and at the same time, basically the explanation of what I'm talking about. And I believe this process is really, I wouldn't say fundamental, but it's really widespread, and it's really characteristic of our culture and perhaps any culture, or at least on this planet, right? So, and I would say, we're moving kind of to the next block. I would say there are two very prominent manifestations of this process in our culture, namely in terms of scale, let's say. So there is a macroscopic, or just macro, manifestation, which I would also call political manifestation, and there is a microscopic manifestation, which I would call personal, of this adoption process. Okay, so there are two levels, let's say, of this process. Or at least there are two possibilities for this process to manifest itself. So in terms of macroscopic adoption of stories, I would say, I'll just give you a couple of examples so we wouldn't be too vague here, because, well, we're talking about details here. So there was a guy in Britain whose last name was Beaumont, which doesn't sound like a British last name, but anyway, I'll give you the links in the description so you can read it for yourself, at least something you can read for yourself. So this Beaumont, he also read Velikovsky, by the way, as far as I know, at least. So what he claimed essentially was that, and again, I'm giving just raw examples so far without any explanation. So he claimed that British city of Bath was what we know from ancient literature as Athens, Greece. Okay, then he claimed that Jerusalem, what we know as Jerusalem, is actually Edinburgh, Scotland. And what we know as ancient Egypt was actually Ireland. That was his claims, etc., etc. So he made a lot of claims of that sort. Then there was, or probably is still, an Italian thinker, or thinker, wherever you prefer, whatever you prefer, Felice Vinci, I think. Again, I'll give you the link. Who claimed that Iliad and Odyssey of Homer actually happened in the Baltic Sea, not in the Mediterranean or Black Sea or whatever, but in the Baltic. All right. Then we have, so these are two examples. Then we have third example of Nikolai Fomenko, who most of you probably know, known for his new chronology, which is actually, he took almost completely from Alexander Morozov, who was a terrorist and a British spy in the Russian Empire and was involved in the murder of Alexander II, the Russian emperor, who invented this new chronology. And Fomenko actually only copied Morozov. He was a Freemason, by the way, also. And so whatever Fomenko added to this new chronology is only attempts at justifying it, firstly, and secondly, idiotic hypotheses on top of it, which are completely ridiculous. So Fomenko, in his own works, on top of Morozov, so to speak, he talks about, for example, well, he tries to basically reinforce the idea that Russia was great before it became mainstream, you know, in some sense. So, for example, just one claim of that sort that he made, he and Nosovsky, his colleague, or whatever you might call it. So he claimed that Cleopatra, the Egyptian princess, or whoever she was actually Prince Oleg from Novgorod. So these are the same person, and his argumentation for that is just brilliant in my opinion. So he claims that, well, in ancient texts we don't have vowels, we only have, you know, consonants. So, and plus in like ancient whatever languages, like Arabic and Hebrew or whatever, okay, I wouldn't go into too much detail, but he claims that letters were read, you know, from right to left, so we should read them backwards, essentially. So this is his justification for claiming that Cleopatra and Oleg are the same people, are the same person, because, well, Oleg is essentially Lg, right? And backwards it reads like Gl, which is like Cleopatra, you know, something like that. So it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of that sort of thinking, you know, but it's still very funny. But anyway, that was the third example, right? So everything happened in Russia rather than Greece, Rome, whatever, Carthage, you name it. That's Fomenko. And then there's another interesting example which comes from my country of all places, and that was Václav Lastovsky, our first prime minister. I mean, we were independent before we got into the Soviet Union, which happened in 1922. But in 1923, and he actually served as a administrative, I don't know what exactly was his office, so to speak, but he actually served in the Soviet Union also, but he was killed during Stalin's repressions in 1938. But he was one of the prominent thinkers of early 20th century in Belarus. So Václav Lastovsky. So he has a very interesting novel, I would say, Labyrinths, of 1923, and I doubt there are any translations, but I'll give you the link to Belarusian text, because who knows, maybe you can read Belarusian or at least use Google Translate or who knows what. So in this text he also claims that actually all those, you know, thinkers and even gods of ancient Greece come from here, roughly from Belarus, like northern parts of it at least. But to his defense, I should say that it is a work of fiction. It's not like an actual statement. It's embedded in a fictional narrative. So it's kind of, and at the end, actually, the main protagonist wakes up. So it was kind of like a dream, you know, what he saw there. So yeah. It's kind of interesting in this respect, and I really hope sometime in the future we'll have a movie, because the plot is really very cool. So anyway, so this is the idea, and there are many other examples like that. It's not the idea; those were examples. So, and there are many other examples like that, like you might remember the famous "We was kangz," you know, which became a meme, etc., etc. So what it all shows, and this is, I remind you, only the macro level, the political level, so to speak, the political manifestation of this pattern of adoption of stories. So we here witness the transplantation or adoption, if you like, of a famous story like Iliad and Odyssey, or story of Jesus, or whatever you prefer, like maybe some Roman stories or whatever, to a place which is kind of removed from them, right? So it's fundamentally an attempt to draw political power from an accepted, let's say, politically, mythically, culturally strong thing. It's an attempt to claim it, you know. So there is ancient Greece, but we, from who knows where, say it was actually us and not ancient Greece. So all the political and cultural power that ancient Greece possesses in the current society, we claim, we say that it was our deed, like let us take it, right? So you should basically cherish us because we are actually descendants of this thing, whatever it is. So this is the basic pattern that we observe everywhere. And by the way, this story of this Italian guy that I've mentioned, this Vinci, it was actually, like, I've read it on Facebook like a few months ago, and it was the motivation for me to make this video. But as usual, I went kind of farther with it, but anyway. If you look at, let's say, ancient Greece and Rome and whatnot themselves, you can find some other pattern there. Similar, but still a bit different. In particular, what I'm talking about is that many, let's say, kings and aristocracy in those ancient societies, they tried to derive their own heritage from gods or from heroes, like legendary mythical heroes, right? So let's say Romans believe they are descendants of Aeneas or Aeneas. I don't know which is the proper English pronunciation, but this Greek hero, right? Or they are at least descendants of Romulus and Remus, right? The legendary / mythical kings of Rome, etc. Or Hercules, like in Greece, many people claim they're descendants of Hercules, or the god Mars or Ares or whatever, you name it. And in medieval times, so it's kind of the same pattern, like we're trying to draw political power from already acknowledged figures of the past, right? Or even not necessarily the past, but myth in the first place. Like, we don't really know if that's happened, but everyone acknowledges that Hercules is super strong, etc. So if you're a descendant of Hercules, you're kind of a cool guy, probably. And in medieval times, so again, it's not an exact transplantation of, oh, I'm modeling my life on Hercules' life, right? I'm just saying that I descend from him, so I'm something different yet related, right? So it's a more soft attempt at deriving power from him. All right, and in medieval times, you can see pretty much the same sort of pattern where people, let's say, well, okay, I don't want to go too deep into this, into the genesis of aristocracy and the ruling class, but basically, people try to prolong their history, prolong their heritage or lineage. People try to, again, by some secondary means, become, you know, descendants of some famous hero or king or whatever. So this process is a very, it's a very characteristic pattern. Again, even in modernity, what do you think all those companies, like, I don't know, whatever, why are they so proud of their long legacy, you know, established in 1883? Wow, so cool. That means that we're super cool. It means that we have this connection to this good old, you know, ye olde days, although it's the oldie actually, because it's a thorn, which is transliterated as Y. So it's the oldie and not ye oldie, but whatever. Yeah. So it's a very prominent pattern. That's basically what I'm saying. And another sort of connected pattern to that is that when people say, well, this person, whatever famous person you like, was actually one of our people, you know, he was not, again, Greek, English, American, Indian, whatever. He was actually from our, you know, country, culture, whatever you name it. It's also the same pattern. We're trying to claim something, some acknowledged figure. We're trying to draw them into our network, to reinforce our network through their influence, right? That's what we're doing here. And it's fundamentally, I would say, driven by pride, all of that I've described above. So, and like, if you go one step further into more fundamental things, it's power, right? Just as I've said, everything is will to power, and pride is one of the manifestations of power. Like, we have something to be proud of. which means we are strong, which means we have a lot of power. So if those guys are on our side, you know, if ancient Greece actually happened in our country and not in ancient Greece, it means that we are super strong, we have a lot of power. So be afraid of us, support us, and like join us in our camp and blah, blah, blah. So everything in this perspective, all the best things, all the famous people, all the famous phenomena, etc., should be ours, should be somehow related to us, etc. So we're trying to, again, bring them home, so to speak, to our domain. Or at least they should be not theirs, you know. So people are, let's say, well, I don't know, people dislike some large imperialistic culture and they're saying, well, they're only so strong because they draw their power from our culture, let's say. So, let's say, American scientist is really not an American scientist, but an Indian scientist or Russian scientist or whatever. But again, that's a long discussion of its own. And see my conspiracy, 2 sources of conspiracy theories video where I talk about this, one of the sources, which is the attack on the winner, so to speak, which is what I'm talking about here. Okay. And of course, again, the same patterns were blooming during Romanticism era. I've already talked about that in one of my videos. I'm not sure which one, but it doesn't really matter. But in Romanticism, when folklore was created, when those national cultures were created, and supposedly ancient texts were found, all those, you know, saga of, like, Ring of Nibelungen or whatever, Icelandic sagas, whereas, you know, even in 19th century in Iceland, like 10,000 people lived. So what kind of sagas are you talking about? It's like one fisherman village on the whole island. So, but whatever. In this our accepted version of history, Icelandic sagas appeared, because why not? So in Romantic era again. So all of that, all of those attempts at drawing power, roughly speaking, from the past have prospered. And I've told you the story of Prosper Mérimée, which is kind of funny in connection to the word prosper, who basically single-handedly like produced a bunch of Balkan folklore. Again, forget about it. So I've already talked about this enough, hopefully. All right, so we talked about this macroscopic level, which tries to draw political power on the scale of whole cultures, right? Nations, etc. But let's talk about the microscopic level, which is not a political, but rather personal level. And on personal level, when we're talking about a single person, we can speak about stories of, or even more so about, I would say, other people, transplanted, again, adopted into your own life, right? Into the life of this particular person. And of course, one of the earliest examples of such procedure, you might say, is religion, like when a believer might try to imitate with their own life, the life of some saint or like some famous religious person of this particular religion. So this is essentially like the basic pattern of these late religions like Christianity or Islam, etc., where you are proposed to behave like this ultimate hero, saint kind of person behaved, right? So you have to embody all those practices in your own life. So this would be also the adoption of this story, whatever the story we are told about this hero, saint, whatever, God, half God, you name it, right? So this was one example, a very prominent one. Another example would be a more, I would say, practical one. Your own family, let's say, obviously, and it's sort of like a golden classic of psychology, that in your own life you tend to reenact, let's say, whatever you've observed in your own family, like the relationships of your parents. Like you tend to, well, again, reenact whatever parent you were associating with, right? So if you have an, well, again, very simple example. If you have a very abusive, like, mother who is emotionally unstable and you're a guy, then you would look for those kinds of women further, right? So you look for abusive, emotionally unstable wife, and that's like, it's again, it's a golden classic. And the same goes for girls. Like, if you have, let's say, an absent, not emotionally connected father who doesn't give you much attention, and you kind of crave for this attention, you would look for guys who behave in the same way, who don't give you any attention, kind of disregard you, and are completely like busy with other things and like screw you. And again, hopefully you can see that. So in this sense, we are transplanting / adopting stories of our parents in our family, and not only parents, I mean, whatever we observe when we're young, we're like a sponge, tend to kind of soak it in, and then reenact it as we grow older in the world. And it's really hard to get rid of. It's almost impossible to get rid of, I would say. It's a very strong influence, at the very least, if not the strongest influence on your life that you can think of, your family. And again, a lot of psychoanalytical practices are derived from that, from at least trying to understand why you behave in this manner. So you need to go back and see what kind of relationships you had in your family, etc., etc. All right, so this is one aspect of this personal projection, personal scale of this problem of adoption of stories. Another important thing is, again, when you're growing up, literature, well, I'm not sure if it's so relevant today. Maybe today more movies and games are much more important in this respect, but I'll use literature as sort of a substitute for all of that, because again, narratively speaking, literature, movies, and games are very similar, right? So it's stories. It's just the medium of telling those stories is different, right? But fundamentally, it's stories. So in literature, again, when young people start reading like classical literature, they see a bunch of interesting characters there, and they start like comparing themselves to them, and perhaps they see some similarities, and perhaps they see that these characters are kind of cool in some respect, and they try to copy them, right? So they try to adopt stories which are told about those heroes. So they try to emulate those heroes, those popular characters, I don't know, from comic books, from classical literature, from movies, etc. Or like actual living people, like celebrities, like, I don't know, Kurt Cobain or Frank Sinatra or Amy Winehouse or whatever, you name it. Like, a young person is really susceptible to those influences, and they tend to kind of try to emulate their hero, so to speak, right? They try to be a hero themselves because they intuitively, they feel that this guy or girl or a man or a woman have something like demonic, in a good sense of word, about them. Genius, you might say. So they try to get closer to that genius. They try to copy them in some way to become a genius themselves, or something to that effect, right? So they try to copy it. And again, famous example from literature, it's kind of funny and / sad example, which was Johann Goethe's book, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, the sorrows of young Werther, where Werther is the last name, obviously, or first name, well, a name anyways, of the protagonist. So it was called Werther effect, Werther effect. so this Werther guy commits suicide, right? And the book was very popular. And a lot of people committed suicide because of that, because of reading this book. They said, yeah, I want to be like this guy. And they killed themselves. So this is what I'm talking about, pretty much. And from my own experience, it's probably not appropriate to talk about this here, but who knows, maybe it would help someone. But in like when I was 16, I've wanted to commit suicide like many times, and I've had plenty of reasons to do that. And they're still out there. At least one of those reasons is still viable. And I was like on the very brink. I actually tried a couple of times, but I didn't succeed. But well, I was too scared, basically. That's the point. But the reason I didn't commit to it like fully was that I've read a lot of Nietzsche back then, and I've read about his suffering, like how he, and again, returning to the previous point, I basically considered myself a copy of Nietzsche, like almost an exact copy. So I thought that if he said like the beginning of a phrase, I could easily end it and it would be like genuine. And to some extent, I still think I have this capacity, but of course it's sort of arrogant to state something like that. But to me, like, he is really myself like 150 years before me, something like that. Not in some sort of mystical sense. I just feel that the structure of my personality is very similar, at the very least. So, at least in some respects. So the reason I didn't commit to it was a simple fact that he didn't. And it might sound uber silly, but it is the case. Like, really, I thought, hey, well, he suffered probably even more than me, and we're very similar, and he didn't kill himself, so probably there's some point in not killing yourself, you know. So yeah, and again, as silly as it may sound, but that's basically the reason I'm still alive. So I don't know, who knows, maybe it would help someone to stay alive, a statement like that. So I'm doing it right now because of that. All right, so, but if we remove ourselves to some more abstract level of thought from all of these examples, why do we try to imitate? Well, I've already stated one of the reasons is because, well, we see someone we adore, perhaps, and perhaps even many other people adore, so we want to be like them, right? And imitation, and what does that mean? We want to have as much power as they have, right? So everything is will to power. So imitation, I would claim, is the primary mode of learning. So in order to learn, in particular, to learn how to have as much power as they do, is to imitate them, right? To do things that they do. And it's completely understandable. And so, yeah, so that's why we tend to adopt the stories that these people embody with their life, enact with their lives, etc. All right. So, as a sort of a semi-conclusion to this microscopic thing, I would claim, again, returning to my own example, I would claim that the example of not only your family, which is acknowledged by psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., psychoanalytics at least, but the impact of celebrities and fictional heroes is underrated. So it's something which is really important for our lives and which impacts our lives in a way that has never been given enough credit, I would say. That would be my point. All right. So probably we'll go to the very conclusion of this video. So what I talked about here, essentially. Oh, okay. One last point before the very conclusion. Or maybe I should make it later as a PS. Okay, let's return to what I talked about here. So culture is a bunch of stories, is a bunch of patterns, is a bunch of networks connected to each other. And there is such process which I call adoption of stories, where a part of the network wants to be as powerful as another part of the network, so they try to transplant all those stories and patterns into their own domain to at least draw power from this, or at least pretend to be this other part of network, right? To draw some power from it on a very abstract level. There are two scales at which this process can and do occur, at least two scales that I've been able to trace, and those are macroscopic scale, which is I call political scale, where we're talking about whole cultures, whole societies, where one society claims that claims their rights, so to speak, on something that another society is acknowledged to have. So you're saying this thing that you have actually belongs to us, whether it is Iliad and Odyssey or Cleopatra or whatever, Athens themselves, as I've given you those examples before. So this is a macroscopic level. So it's fundamentally driven by the desire of having more power from the side of certain culture, i.e. having more pride, etc. But those are more particular manifestations of power, etc., etc. And there is a microscopic level where we're talking about a person, where a person might emulate, reenact, like embody stories from other people, right? Whether that's literary characters, or, I mean fictitious characters, or real celebrities, real characters, or I don't know, whatever, you name it. There aren't many options, really. And so this is what I've talked about so far, and this is more or less the conclusion. But one other thing I wanted to mention here, and it's kind of important from a gnoseological or epistemological, if you like, point of view, when we're talking about the fundamentals of knowledge. So what we're dealing with here, this whole process, it can be also disintegrated into two steps, I would say. So it's a two-step process. So one step, I would claim, is we need to firstly construct the story we're trying to emulate, we're trying to adopt. So without us acknowledging that the ancient Greece is a cool thing, without us constructing the story of good old ancient Greece, we wouldn't even proceed to the second step. So we need to construct this story that ancient Greece was a cool place, everyone knows ancient Greece, it has a bunch of cultural power, it has a bunch of political capital, so to speak, cultural capital. So we need to transplant this. So we've already established that ancient Greece was a cool place, blah, blah, blah. But this is another story in a nutshell. Even though it's supported by many people consider that this is true. But this is still a perspective, because you can also get another perspective. You can say, well, ancient Greece didn't even exist, let's say. It's all, I don't know, fictional, or whatever, you name it. Or ancient Greece was horrible. Everything you can read from ancient Greeks themselves is a lie, etc. Blah, blah, blah. So this first step would be demolished then, and you wouldn't proceed further. But if you've established this construct, that ancient Greece is a cool place, you proceed to the second step. Which is adopting it, like, let's copy whatever we think ancient Greece looked like. So again, you construct some fictitious, by all means, like, for what it's worth, fictitious picture of ancient Greece. You tell a story about this type of ancient Greece, so to speak, and you try to transplant this story that you've yourself constructed, or somebody else constructed, but you support it. You transplant this into your own domain, and you say, it was us, let's say, or let's do it like they did, or whatever. So it's a two-step process. And what I'm saying basically is that you're not taking stuff as it was, right? You're just, firstly, you construct stuff as it was. So in some fundamental sense, this stuff even wasn't, in the first place. You're looking at it from your own perspective, from your own network. You're interpreting whatever really happened. So you create this picture in the first place. Okay, it kind of gets too vague and too abstract, but hopefully you get the idea. So in order to transplant something, you need to firstly construct whatever you're trying to transplant, and this is an in some sense artificial operation. All right. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.